I remember the exact moment the microphone left Adrian's hand, and the moment it was clear no one in that gymnasium was going to stop him from speaking. 283 families had gathered in the auditorium of Westfield High School in southwest Houston that June afternoon, the kind of heat-drenched day where the air conditioning works overtime and nobody's makeup stays intact past the first hour. The principal had just introduced him as a generous donor to the school's new science facility, and there he was, my husband of 19 years, climbing those 3 steps to the stage with the confidence of a man who has never once questioned his right to be the center of attention. Iris had just delivered her valedictorian address. She'd been magnificent. I want to emphasize that, because it matters, she had stood in that spotlight with a steadiness I recognized from watching her practice, and she thanked her teachers, her friends, and then she paused and looked directly at me, sitting in the 3rd row in my navy dress uniform, and she said, "I want to thank my mother for never once making me feel like I was anyone's second choice." I had cried silently. The way I'd learned to cry during 14 years of active deployment without letting my shoulders shake, without letting anyone around me know exactly what I was feeling. And then Adrian took the microphone. I knew something was wrong before he even opened his mouth. I can read a room the way some people read books. That's what the military teaches you if you stay long enough. You learn to notice the small shifts, the microscopic changes in posture and breathing that signal what's about to happen. Adrian had that look. The look of a man who had rehearsed something he'd convinced himself was funny, or justified, or both. He smiled out at the crowd with the casual ease of someone accustomed to being liked, and then he said it. "I want to thank Victoria for raising my mistress's daughter all these years." The words landed exactly the way he must have meant them to land. The auditorium went absolutely quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the suspended quiet of 283 people holding their breath, waiting to understand if they'd heard correctly. Everyone looked at me. I felt the weight of 283 gazes, and I didn't move. That was the first moment where I understood that the life I'd carefully constructed over 18 years could be reframed in a single sentence by someone who'd never truly been present for any of it. I need to take you back to understand how we got here, and I want to be honest about something right from the start. This isn't a story about a bad man and a good woman. It's a story about what happens when one person's silence becomes another person's survival strategy, and what happens when that silence finally breaks. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hayes. At 32 years old, I found out I couldn't have biological children, and I want to tell you, that moment sitting in a parking lot, outside a fertility clinic, in an area of Houston that doesn't exist anymore. The asphalt so hot, it was melting slightly at the edges, changed the shape of everything that came after. The doctor had been kind. That was almost worse. He'd sat across from his desk and used the word unlikely in a tone that meant never, and I had not cried. I had not cried because 14 years in the Navy teaches you how to hold things without letting your face show it. You learn to compartmentalize pain the way you compartmentalize classified information. It stays locked away until the moment you're trained to access it, and most of the time, you're trained never to access it at all. My husband Adrian had reacted differently when I told him. He'd been devastated in the way that people are when they lose something they assumed was guaranteed. But over the following months and years, we'd stopped talking about it the way couples do, when a wound gets familiar enough that touching it again feels like a choice you don't need to make. I was deployed for 11 months after that diagnosis. 11 months away from my wife. Away from the life I'd believed would eventually include children, deployed to the Middle East with a job that required my full attention and a heart that couldn't afford to be in 2 places simultaneously. That's what deployment does. It demands everything, or it takes everything. There's no middle ground. Adrian handled the distance worse than I expected him to handle anything. I understood that at the time, or I told myself I understood it. What I didn't understand was what loneliness could turn into when you leave someone alone long enough to reshape their own narrative. I remember the exact smell of our house when I came home from that rotation. It was something I'd never smelled before, and I couldn't name it immediately. Formula and baby powder and something else, something that made my stomach drop before my brain caught up to what my senses were telling me. Adrian was standing in the living room. He was holding a baby. He didn't say hello. He said, "There's something I need to tell you." And in the time it took him to say that one sentence, I understood that my life had divided into a before and an after, and the before was already becoming a story I would have to rewrite. The baby was his. The biological mother was a woman named Tasha Morrison, someone from his office, Someone I'd shaken hands with once at a company holiday party 3 years earlier and thought nothing of. He told me she hadn't wanted the responsibility, his exact word, responsibility, as if a child could be filed away like a tax return. He told me she'd signed away her rights. He told me he hadn't known what else to do. He said I'm sorry over and over until the words stopped meaning anything and started sounding like the sound a machine makes when it's broken and just keeps repeating the same error. I could have walked out that night. I think most people would have understood if I had. I was a military officer. I had achieved things that mattered. I had a career that was built on my own discipline, and I owed a stranger's child absolutely nothing. But then I looked at her. She was 8 months old, dark-haired, wide-eyed, wearing a tiny yellow dress that probably cost more than Adrian had ever spent on clothes in his life. She was looking up at me with an expression that had nothing whatsoever to do with Adrian or Tasha or any of the choices the adults around her had made. She just looked tired and hungry and small. And something inside me, something that a doctor with kind eyes and a hard word had broken 2 years earlier in that parking lot, suddenly found a way to matter again. I don't know how to explain that moment except to say that I reached out, and she wrapped her entire fist around one of my fingers. Not gently. She grabbed on like she was drowning. I named her Iris. Adrian said I could call her whatever I wanted, since I was the one who was going to be raising her. He said that with the kind of certainty that told me he understood he'd never been much good at the day-to-day work of loving someone. That was the first honest thing he'd said to me in weeks. That was 18 years ago. Now I was sitting in a folding chair in a gymnasium, watching that same small girl walk across a stage in a blue cap and gown, and I had never in my life felt prouder of anything. Not my commission, not my 3 medals, not a single achievement that filled the walls of my career. Nothing came close. The years in between blur together in the way that good years do, where you look back and realize you were building something without ever naming it as such. I remember taking Iris to her first day of preschool, watching her wave at me through the glass door of the classroom like I was the only person in the entire world worth waving at. I remember the deployments where I missed her first school play, her first day of kindergarten, her 7th birthday, her 3rd grade spelling bee. I remember calling her every single night from bases in different time zones, whispering stories into a phone that crackled with static while she fell asleep with the phone still pressed to her ear on the other end of the line. I remember being the one who sat with her through a 104-degree fever when she was 6 years old, sponging her forehead with cool water at 3 in the morning, while Adrian slept down the hall, too tired from work to be much help. Those details matter. People romanticize sacrifice, but they don't understand that it's made up of these small moments, these ordinary choices, repeated so many times they become the foundation of a person's identity. It's the math tutor you find at midnight because your daughter has decided she hates mathematics. It's teaching her to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings, gripping the door handle while she stalls the car for the 4th time and laughs until she cries. It's learning to recognize when someone is lying to you so you can teach her to recognize it too. Adrian was present for some of it, mostly birthdays and school photos, moments that could be captured and preserved and shown to people as evidence of his fatherhood. But the daily work, the unglamorous, invisible work of raising a human being that was mine. Iris never once treated our relationship as anything less than real. She called me Mom from the time she could speak. Not stepmom, not Dad's wife, just Mom, plain and unqualified. And every time she said it, something that had been broken in that parking lot years earlier quietly mended itself a little further. What I didn't fully understand until much later was that Adrian had started to see all of this differently. Where I saw a family we'd built together out of something terrible, he'd begun to see my raising Iris as a debt I was paying off for his mistake, rather than a life I'd chosen for myself every single day since that night in our kitchen. That distinction would matter more than I could have imagined when I finally let myself see it clearly. Around February of that year, 5 months before graduation, I began noticing things I'd trained myself not to notice. Small changes that wouldn't have mattered individually, but accumulated into a pattern I couldn't ignore. Adrian coming home late without explanation. His phone suddenly requiring a passcode when for years it had sat face up on the kitchen counter. He changed the password on our joint email account and never gave me the new one. When I mentioned retirement planning, or the trip to Portugal we'd talked about for a decade, he'd changed the subject to something financial, to numbers instead of dreams. I am by training and temperament someone who notices what people are trying not to show you. 14 years of active duty teaches you to read the small shifts. So once I let myself actually look, I saw everything. Adrian was preparing to leave. And worse, he'd reconnected with Tasha Morrison. Not romantically, or not only romantically, but strategically. The two of them apparently aligned on something. I would later learn what. The thing that actually took my breath away came almost by accident when I found a folder in Adrian's desk drawer I wasn't supposed to see. Inside were photocopies of Iris's original birth certificate, listing Tasha as the biological mother and Adrian as the father, with a blank space where a second parent's name might have gone. There was no adoption decree, no guardianship paperwork. In 18 years, through countless conversations about finances and Emily's future, Adrian had never once mentioned that I had absolutely no legal standing as Iris's mother at all. I understood immediately what this meant. In a divorce, in any fight over the house, the assets, the story, I could be painted as nothing more than a long-term caregiver. A woman who'd overstepped. The paperwork said I was nobody. I sat with that folder in my lap for a long time that evening, in an empty house, and I felt something harden inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with clarity. Because Adrian didn't know, he'd never bothered to learn that I'm the kind of woman who keeps meticulous records. Not out of suspicion, but out of discipline. Every school enrollment form I'd signed as Iris's guardian. Every medical consent form, every pediatrician's visit, every permission slip, every insurance document listing me as her primary caregiver. Emails between Adrian and me discussing her education, her therapy after a difficult period in middle school, her college fund. It was all there, in my handwriting, my signature, 18 years of showing up, dated and filed, and waiting quietly in a filing cabinet, for the moment someone tried to say it hadn't happened. That discipline was about to become something else entirely. Not a weapon exactly. I never wanted to hurt Adrian. Not really, not even then, but armor. Proof. The truth organized and undeniable. But before any of that could matter, Iris needed to understand what was happening. I sat her down at the kitchen table one evening, and chose my words carefully. Whatever happens between your father and me, I told her, you don't have to choose. This isn't yours to fix. It never was. She nodded in that quiet way that should have told me she already understood far more than I'd given her credit for. It turned out that Iris had overheard a phone call 3 weeks earlier when Adrian thought he'd made it in private late at night, when he assumed she was asleep upstairs. She'd come down for water and paused on the bottom step when she heard her father's voice, low and unfamiliar, talking to a woman she didn't recognize by name but understood immediately by context. And then Adrian had said one sentence, delivered so casually, it barely registered as cruelty to the man, saying it, Victoria was never really her mother. That sentence had burned itself into Iris's memory in a way nothing else could have. She confronted Adrian directly. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked him one question that he couldn't answer, not honestly. Then where were you when I needed someone? He had no response. There wasn't one that wouldn't indict him. And that conversation cracked something open that had been sealed for years. Iris told me she remembered a fight when she was 7 or 8, where Adrian's voice had gotten loud, where he'd said something about how maybe it would be simpler if Iris went to live with her biological mother instead, since things were complicated the way they were. She'd filed that away the way children do with things too large to process, a splinter she carried without knowing its name. I remembered that period differently. I remembered fighting Adrian on exactly that idea, refusing to let him destabilize a child who'd already been abandoned once. I'd won that argument. I'd never told Iris how close it had come to going the other way. 3 weeks before graduation, I made an appointment with a family law attorney named Catherine Reeves. She was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses perched on gray hair, and the manner of someone who'd heard every variation of my story before, and none of it surprised her anymore. I laid out the folder I'd found, the birth certificate, 18 years of documentation. Iris was technically an adult now, but symbolically vital. I needed that truth on paper, finally. Catherine reviewed everything methodically. She explained de facto parentage, the legal recognition some states extend to someone who's functioned as a parent in every meaningful way without formal adoption. She explained that my 18 years of meticulous record-keeping, all of it unknowingly assembled, was substantial, dated, corroborated evidence of exactly the kind courts take seriously. He clearly wasn't expecting you to be prepared, Catherine said. I almost laughed. Preparation had never been the plan. It had simply been who I was. We discussed the assets methodically. The house, the retirement accounts I'd contributed to throughout my career, the military benefits I'd earned, Emily's college fund, which I'd funded almost entirely myself. Catherine looked at my file and then looked up at me. "Divorce is going to be straightforward," she said. "You have documentation for everything." The week before graduation, Adrian mentioned that he'd been asked to say a few words at the ceremony. I hadn't known this. I didn't ask how he felt about it or whether he'd planned to share anything meaningful. I simply nodded and let the silence of my non-response speak its own language. I moved out of the bedroom that same week. Not dramatically. I simply took my things and moved to the guest room down the hall. I didn't slam doors. I didn't leave a note. I just stopped pretending that anything between us was still intact and let the quiet of that decision do the work. Adrian asked me once, almost gently, if we could talk things through. I told him we could talk once the paperwork was filed and not before. He looked at me differently after that. Not angry, but unsettled. As though he was beginning to understand for the first time in 18 years that the woman standing in front of him was no longer someone he could manage with a well-timed apology. The graduation ceremony was perfect until it wasn't. There's a specific quality to that kind of afternoon, the kind you replay in your mind for years afterward. Sunlight coming through the high windows, the smell of fresh flowers, 283 families packed into folding chairs, proud and restless and ready to celebrate. Iris delivered her valedictorian address, and I watched the daughter I'd raised with 18 years of invisible work stand in that spotlight and thank me for never making her feel like anyone's mistake. And then the principal called Adrian up, and everything changed. I watched him climb those 3 steps. I watched him take the microphone with the casual confidence of a man who'd convinced himself he earned the right to it. I watched him find my eyes in the crowd and smile that same practiced smile I'd loved once, and then I watched his mouth form the words that would reshape my entire 18-year story in front of everyone I knew. "Thank you for raising my mistress's daughter." The room went absolutely silent. No one breathed. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up and walk out. I did something that might have been worse. I did absolutely nothing. I let my body stay completely still, my face completely blank, the way I'd been trained to hold things for 14 years. But inside, something I'd carefully constructed was being torn apart in front of an audience, and they were all watching it happen. What I didn't know was what Iris was thinking in those seconds while the room held its breath. I would learn later that she'd heard those words and felt them like a physical blow, like a door slamming. She told me afterward that for a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, could only feel the weight of 283 people turning to look at her, and then at her mother, and then at the man on the stage who just rewrote their entire family story in 5 words. And then something in her shifted, something crystallized. She stood up, not rushed, not emotional, just deliberate. She stood up and smoothed the front of her gown and walked toward the stage where her father still stood holding the microphone, apparently unaware yet of what was about to happen. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. When she spoke, it was in the same measured tone she'd used delivering her valedictorian address minutes earlier. The tone of someone who'd rehearsed nothing and needed to. "You thanked Mom for raising your mistress's daughter," Iris said. "But you forgot one thing." She turned then and looked directly at me, and I remember the exact expression on her face. Not anger, not performance. Just a kind of fierce, unwavering love that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. "She didn't raise your mistress's daughter," Iris said. "She raised her daughter." I heard the room shift beneath that sentence, a low murmur rippling through the crowd. Parents leaning toward each other, phones quietly rising, to record what everyone in that room now understood was happening in real time. Adrian opened his mouth to speak, but Iris wasn't finished. Something in her posture made it clear that no one was going to interrupt her. "You weren't there when I was sick," she said. "You weren't there when I was afraid. You weren't the one waiting outside my school when I forgot my ride. You weren't the one who taught me what it means to keep a promise. You weren't the one who stayed when leaving would have been easier." Each sentence landed like a measured blow. Not cruel, just true, which somehow made it worse for the man standing frozen at the center of the stage. I watched Adrian's face change in real time, the practiced ease draining out of it, replaced by something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen from him in years. He looked smaller suddenly, diminished by the truth of what his own daughter was saying about him. So if you're embarrassed that Mom raised your daughter, Iris said, and her voice was steady in a way that made the entire auditorium lean in closer, you should be embarrassed that you didn't. Adrian said nothing. There was nothing left to say. And then Iris did something that changed the room entirely. She turned away from her father and looked directly at me, and when she spoke, her voice softened for the first time. "And I'm not your mistress's daughter anymore," she said. "I'm Mom's daughter. I'm Mom's daughter." I don't remember standing up. I only remember that at some point I was on my feet, and Iris was crossing the small distance between the stage and the front row, and I was holding my daughter the way I'd held her that first night 18 years earlier when she was small enough to fit in one arm and the whole rest of our story was still unwritten. The auditorium was quiet for a few seconds longer. And then someone in the back began clapping, a teacher I learned later, and the sound spread through the room like something catching fire until the whole gymnasium was on its feet, applauding not for a valedictorian speech, but for a truth that had finally been spoken out loud by the one person whose voice mattered most. Adrian stood alone on that stage, microphone still in his hand, and for the first time in 18 years, no one in that room was looking at him at all. He found me in the parking lot afterward while Iris was still surrounded by friends and teachers offering congratulations. He looked smaller out there in the afternoon light, the confidence that had carried him through all those years now completely gone. "I made a mistake," he said. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered. When I spoke, my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. "No, Adrian," I said. "You made choices. A mistake is something that happens to you. A choice is something you make again and again until it becomes who you are. You chose distance over presence. You chose to leave instead of staying. You chose to humiliate a woman in public instead of having the courage to face what you'd done in private. None of that was a mistake. That was a pattern. And patterns don't deserve the same forgiveness accidents do." He didn't argue. He just stood there looking at someone he'd spent 18 years underestimating, finally understanding that he'd completely misread the strength of the woman standing in front of him. The weeks that followed were unremarkable in the way that matters most. Catherine filed the divorce paperwork with the steady competence she'd shown from our first meeting. The assets were divided according to the law, and according to the documentation I'd unknowingly spent 18 years assembling. I didn't ask for anything beyond what was rightfully mine. I didn't need to punish Adrian to feel like the truth had finally been told. Adrian lost far more than assets in the months that followed. He lost Iris's trust gradually, through her quiet, deliberate distance, fewer calls, shorter visits, a wall that hadn't existed before, but that he'd built himself one absence at a time. Here's what I need you to understand about what happened that day in that gymnasium. It wasn't really about Adrian anymore. It was about Iris finally understanding something I'd been living with for 18 years, that love isn't about biology. It's about showing up. And that the people who truly love you aren't the ones who make the grand gestures. They're the ones who show up on the ordinary days. They're the ones who stay when it would be easier to leave. They're the ones who see you completely and choose you anyway. I've spent decades in military service learning about commitment, about duty, about what it means to protect people who can't protect themselves. And I learned something else entirely from raising a child who wasn't mine by blood but became mine by every choice that actually mattered. Real motherhood, real parenthood isn't about giving birth. It's about staying. It's about protecting. It's about sacrificing without keeping score. It's about loving someone on the hard days as fiercely as the easy ones. It's about choosing them over and over long after anyone would have blamed you for walking away. That's the lesson Iris taught the entire world that day. She showed them what loyalty looks like. She showed them what strength looks like. She showed them that sometimes the most powerful voice in a room is the quiet one that simply speaks the truth. I think about that fertility clinic parking lot often now, the one from all those years ago. The doctor's voice telling me the word unlikely in a tone meant to be gentle. I spent a long time believing that moment had defined the shape of my life. A door closing. A future narrowing. I understand now how wrong I was. That closed door simply made room for a different one to open. One I never could have predicted. It opened onto a child who wasn't mine by biology, but became mine by every moment I chose to show up. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. Have you ever felt like you weren't enough because you couldn't do something the traditional way? Have you ever believed that because your life didn't look like you planned it would look, it somehow meant less? Because if you have, I want you to hear what Iris said in that auditorium that day. What you do, who you become, What you build, those things matter infinitely more than how you got there. If you've ever been the person in the room who wasn't recognized, who wasn't thanked, whose sacrifice went invisible, I want you to know that someone is watching you, someone is learning from you, someone is becoming who they are because of who you decided to be. I want to know where this story finds you today. Are you watching from somewhere with people you love around you? Are you alone right now, sitting with something heavy that you haven't told anyone about? Are you the person who shows up invisibly? The one who holds things together? The one who sacrifices without being asked? Drop a comment below and tell me. Use 1, 2, or 3. 1. If you've ever felt like your sacrifice went unrecognized. 2. If you've been in Adrian's position and didn't even realize what you were losing. 3. If you've stood up for someone the way Iris did and felt that power of finally speaking the truth out loud. We have stories like this one every single day here. Stories about people who chose love over fear, who built something beautiful out of broken pieces. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the moment when someone's entire life changes with one sentence spoken out loud. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Thank you for seeing the people who show up invisibly. Let's keep going. Subscribe now. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Houston, Texas to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.